Hi, I'm the History Guy. I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. Submarines played a crucial role in the Cold War, carrying the ballistic missiles that helped to maintain that terrifying balance called mutually assured destruction. Missile submarines and attack submarines played a risky game of cat and mouse in the world's oceans and still do today, and it was a very dangerous game for everybody involved. And one good example of that proves that danger today lies some 18,000 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. The 1986 explosion aboard the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-219 is history that deserves to be remembered. The Cold War expansion of the Soviet Navy into a global sea power is largely attributed to the efforts of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy in 1956, a position he would hold for nearly 3 decades. In the midst of a Soviet military mindset focused on land power, Gorshkov managed to create a vision of a Soviet fleet that could advance Soviet strategic objectives and challenge the United States as a global sea power. He was quoted in Time magazine in 1968 boasting that the flag of the Soviet Navy now proudly flies over the oceans of the world. Submarines were central to Soviet naval strategy, owing largely to Soviet geography. While Gorshkov advocated a more balanced fleet, he nonetheless oversaw the largest submarine construction program in history, including significant advances in Soviet submarine technology. More important to strategy was Gorshkov's emphasis on numbers. He famously adhered to a philosophy that said that better is the enemy of good enough, which meant that he wanted to have more boats at sea even if they were only good enough. In practice, this meant that the Soviet Union kept older submarines at sea longer than their Western counterparts, and this did impact the safety of the Soviet submarine navy. The submarine navy suffered from a number of issues of design, of maintenance, of crew quality and training that contributed to a number of Cold War accidents. The 1980s saw a particularly tense period of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan had been elected in 1980, arguing for a strategy of peace through strength that was intended to bankrupt the Soviet Union through military competition. Between 1980 and 1985, the number of dollars devoted each year to defense more than doubled, from $142.6 billion to $286.8 billion. The Reagan administration spent more than $1.5 trillion on defense, forcing the Soviet Union to compete in a way that hastened the eventual downfall of the Soviet Union, although historians disagree over the degree to which the buildup was responsible. One response to the U.S. buildup was to increase the Soviet ballistic missile submarine presence by rushing deployment. Now Soviet submarines, many already using outdated technology, were sent on more deployments with less downtime, increasing the risk of accident due to a reduced maintenance and training schedule. One submarine impacted by the faster deployment schedule was the Soviet Navaga-class ballistic missile submarine K-219. The Navaga class, which NATO designated the Yankee 1, began service in 1967. They're the first Soviet ballistic missile submarines to carry missiles with thermonuclear warheads, with a yield comparable to the Polaris missiles used by American and British ballistic missile submarines. With a length of 420 feet and a displacement of 11,500 tons submerged, the Yankee 1 carried 16 ballistic missiles in the hull, as well as mounting 6 torpedo tubes. With a standard crew of 114, the submarine's 2 nuclear pressurized water reactors provided the boat with light, heat, water, fresh air, and of course propulsion that allowed a top speed of 28 knots. Commissioned December 31st, 1971, the K-219 was old technology by the time she put to sea in September of 1986. One of Gorshkov's good-enough submarines sent to man the so-called patrol box east of Bermuda. The decade-and-a-half-old K-219 had already been the victim of an accident that underlined the risks of submarine warfare. The R-27 submarine-launched ballistic missiles that the Navaga-class submarines carried was, unlike their Polaris counterparts, liquid-fueled. They used what is called a hypergolic combination, where a fuel, in this case unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, is combined with an oxidizer, nitrogen tetroxide, to produce ignition. Hypergolic fuels have the advantage of being easily and reliably ignited without requiring an outside source like a spark plug. But the downside is that the chemicals involved are extremely dangerous, being both poisonous and corrosive, and, of course, explosive if they come in contact with each other. Even more terrifying aboard a submarine, nitrogen tetroxide is highly reactive with seawater. When combined, that can produce poison gas and corrosive nitric acid. Allow enough oxidizer and water to mix, and you get a powerful, poisonous acid that can eat through nearly everything. That, in fact, had already happened to the K-219 in 1976, just a few years after the ship had been commissioned. A small leak in the seal in the vessel's number 16 silo had allowed seawater to drip in. were combined with residual nitrogen tetroxide to form powerful nitric acid that had melted through a hydrazine line, causing an explosion and killing a sailor. The silo had been too damaged to repair, and silo number 16 of the K-219 was permanently welded shut, reducing her missile complement to 15. The demands of the more rapid deployment schedule had a large effect on K-219 that fall. The boat was to be captained by Captain Second Rank Igor Britanov, and while Britanov was an experienced commander, the K-219 was not his normal boat, as the K-219 for this patrol was going to be crewed by what was normally the first crew for a different submarine, the K-241. Not only was he on an unfamiliar boat, but the crew had been shuffled. 11 of the vessel's 31 staff officers, including the executive officer, and 16 of 38 non-commissioned officers had been replaced and were not operating with their normal crew. On an unfamiliar, aging boat whose maintenance time had been shortened, Britanov was sailing with a crew not used to working with each other. After 30 days at sea, on October 3rd, K-219 moved into its designated patrol area in the Sargasso Sea in the North Atlantic, when an engineer in the forward missile compartment discovered water dripping from under the plug of missile tube number 6, the third tube from the bow on the port side. The dripping soon turned into a stream of seawater. The captain had the boat taken to a shallower depth while an attempt was made to pump the water out, but a cloud of brown corrosive oxidant started coming from under the missile. The captain declared an accident alert that included damage control measures like hermetically sealing all compartments. The crew's quick work likely saved the boat, as 5 minutes later the submarine was rocked by an explosion in missile tube number 6. Seawater had mixed with oxidizer, and the resulting nitric acid had eaten through something critical. Inside the missile silo, oxidizer mixed with fuel, and the resulting chemical explosion was so powerful that it ejected the destroyed RSM-25 missile and its 2 thermonuclear warheads out of the submarine. Some of the high explosive around the warheads also exploded, which meant that radioactive debris was being sent both into the ocean and into the submarine. The explosion was so powerful that it tore apart the thick missile tube, and more than 4.5 tons of seawater went into the bilge, causing the submarine to lose buoyancy and sink over 800 feet in moments. 2 crewmen were killed in the initial blast, and the missile officer died shortly thereafter from the toxic fumes. Black smoke was pouring through the aft missile compartment where 25 crewmen were trapped, and the boat lost status information on the remaining missile tubes. The boat had lost its loudspeaker system and its radio transmitter. Captain Britanov ordered the crew to blow all tanks in an effort to stop the sinking and surface the boat. It is a desperate last-ditch attempt that would use up all the submarine's compressed air, and if it failed, the submarine would sink to the bottom of the ocean and be crushed by the ocean's pressure. Blowing the tanks worked. The boat began to rise. Just 2 minutes after the explosion, it breached the ocean surface uncontrolled, like a missile exiting the water, the bow shooting up before settling back, smoke pouring out of the ruptured silo. They were able to contact command, which diverted the closest Soviet merchant vessels. Inside the submarine, the corrosive gas was slowly eating away at the vitals of the submarine. Seals were corroding away, pipes were exploding, gauges were going blank. Radioactivity in the missile room, which is abaft of the conning tower, essentially cut the crew off in the middle so that the crew in the bow and the stern could not reach each other in order to help control the damage. Poison gas was seeping from compartment to compartment, making ever more of the submarine uninhabitable. And there was a fire burning somewhere in the missile compartment that was raising the heat to the extent that there was a fear that the remaining missiles could cook off and release masses of radioactive debris into the Gulf Stream. Then, suddenly, a new crisis. The heat alarm started going off in the reactor room. The fires and corrosion had eaten through the systems that powered the cooling systems. If the reactors overheated, the rods would melt straight through the boat and release a cloud of radioactive steam worse than the accident at Chernobyl that would blow over the British overseas territory of Bermuda. The reactors had to be shut down, a process called SCRAM. The system was designed to drop heat baffles that would essentially drown the nuclear fires, and they worked as they should on one of the 2 reactors. But on the second reactor, the heat had warped the springs, and the baffles did not drop. They could be cranked down by hand, but only from inside the reactor. 2 members of the crew, Lieutenant N.N. Belikov and Seaman S.A. Preminin, volunteered for the assignment. The radiation suits they had were completely insufficient, and the compartment was over 180 degrees. They managed to manually lower 2 of the baffles in 2 trips, but Belikov collapsed from heat exhaustion. 20-year-old sailor Sergei Preminin made the 3rd trip alone, lowering the baffle that prevented, perhaps, the worst nuclear disaster in the history of the world. By the time he was done, the pressure between the 2 compartments had become so different that the door could not be opened, despite desperate attempts to force it. Preminin died of heat exhaustion and asphyxiation inside the reactor. Because of the poison gas and radiation, the crew of the K-219 had to be evacuated to the merchant vessels that arrived, although Captain Britanov remained on the bridge. There was an attempt to tow the K-219 to get repairs, but the tow line broke, and eventually the flooding was just unrecoverable. On October 8th, the K-219 rolled and slipped beneath the waves. Captain Britanoff was the last crew member to evacuate. Today, the Soviet submarine K-219 lies at the bottom of the Hatteras Abyssal Plain. The Soviet government blamed Captain Britanoff because he was unable to save his boat. He was charged with negligence, sabotage, and treason, although the charges were all eventually dropped. Some have maintained, including at times at least unofficially the Soviet government, that the K-219 was the victim of an accidental collision with an American attack submarine that was trailing the K-219, and that's what caused the water to get in that caused the explosion. And that event was portrayed in the 1997 made-for-TV movie Hostile Waters. However, both Captain Britanoff and the United States Navy strongly deny that there was ever any collision, and they blame the accident on a faulty seal on the missile cover, which is of course exactly what happened in the earlier accident aboard K-219 in 1976. 4 crewmen aboard the K-219 were killed in the accident. Crewman Sergei Preminin was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star for his heroism. In the end, it was rather amazing that Captain Britanoff was able to save his crew and that his crew was able to avert nuclear disaster. When he was interviewed in 1998 and asked what the biggest lesson of the explosion aboard the K-219 was, he said, "Take care of your people, and they will take care of you." I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series of short snippets of forgotten history about 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button, which is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. And if you'd like more snippets of forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.